Good day. This is your hillbilly historian coming to you from the hills of East Tennessee with history you'll never see in your high school textbooks or your college textbooks. You got to dig for what I give you. Now, today I want to talk about Barbarossa, one of the largest invasions in the history of mankind. The Barbarossa German invasion of Russia in 1941 was bigger than anything Genghis Khan ever did, or Attila the Hun, or any tribal nation or any advanced civilized nation. No invasion had ever occurred that was that large. Now, Barbarossa was Hitler's attempt to obtain land for a German settlement, Lebensraum, living space for Germans. And he looked down upon the Slavs and the Kulaks and the Ukrainians and the people who resided on that land and had for centuries and had farmed it successfully for many thousands of years. He looked down his nose at these as being less than human people, and he followed his troops with what they called Einsatzgruppen. These were men to round up the communists, the gypsies, the Jews, the Slavs, and execute them. And they documents from one of these four Einsatzgruppens. One of them, the documents survived, so we were able to see what they were actually doing, what their agenda was. But anyway, Russia was invaded by Germany. Germany tried to do what Napoleon failed to do. Russian generals, amazingly, they invaded Russia with something like a little over 3 million men and over 600,000 horses. Now, the fact they were relying on 600,000 horses to invade an area that was so huge, it was larger than some continents. It was amazing how large Russia is. It just goes on and on forever. And Russia did not have all-weather roads. All-weather roads occurred inside major cities like Kiev, Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad, but there were no all-weather roads outside in the rural areas. So when you had rains, especially heavy rains, roads turned to mud, sometimes 2 and 3 foot deep. You'd get marred up in it. You couldn't get out. You had to tow trucks with dozers and stuff. I mean, and with tanks. And relying on over 600,000 horses in an area where logistics was going to have to be one of the most important parts of invading an area that large. You got to have food and ammunition and fuel and everything for your armies, and over 600,000 horses just was not going to get it done. So outside of the panzer divisions and the fully mechanized infantry divisions, the German army, 80% of it wasn't any more advanced than what Napoleon had 140 years earlier. Amazing that they would try to conquer a property that large, not having a good logistical plus maintenance. maintenance was, they were not prepared. They didn't have spare parts. They were robbing parts from one tank to keep another tank moving. And the German tanks required something like 10 hours of maintenance for 1 hour of operation. That was unacceptable. The maintenance on U.S. tanks, the Sherman, and over 50,000 Shermans were built in World War II. Only about 1,400 Panzer Tigers, the Baltic Tiger tank of the German army. They only had about 1,400 of them. At the Battle of Kursk, they only had maybe 500 or 600 of them there. Shermans, you could get 10 hours of operation for 1 hour of maintenance. And they made a lot of spare parts. And another thing, in the U.S. Invasion of Europe, North Africa, Italy, and Europe, if a tank broke down, they repaired it right there on the front lines. They had spare parts, maintenance crews that would come up and repair the tank and get it going again. And Germany, if a tank broke down, they had to send it back to the factory where it was manufactured for repairs. So it had to be shipped all the way back to Germany, and then once it was repaired, shipped all the way back to the front. When the German army reached Moscow in December 1941, when the cold spell really hit hard, there was one Panzer division sitting there in front of Moscow that did not have a single tank left. All of them had broke down. You know, trucks broke down. These unpaved roads were clouded with dust. You turned up dust when it was dry. And dust was hard on engines. You know, it got in your oil and everything, and your air filter just couldn't keep it all out. And so trucks broke down. Track vehicles broke down. Tanks broke down. And when you're covering hundreds upon hundreds of kilometers and miles, and you have tanks and tracks and vehicles that tend to break down anyway, and you do not have a frontline maintenance ability, you're up the creek. And Germany did not have a good reinforcement system set up. For every 2 casualties, they were only getting 1 reinforcement. So the strength of their units was depreciating. The more they advanced, the weaker they got. So when they got to Leningrad, they did not have the power to overcome the defenses at Leningrad and take the city. They did not have the power to overcome and take Moscow. And then a year later, same with Stalingrad. You know, when they got there, they were so weakened, the 6th Army was so weakened, they couldn't take over. But maintenance, service, and then another thing Germany did that none of the Allies, Russia allowed women to do everything. There were women snipers. I think one of their best was a female. They had women tank drivers. They had women in their infantry. They had women doing all kinds of auxiliary services, plus actually fighting in the front lines. If, you know, at the end of the war in Berlin, before they broke everybody up into sections and made them go into their own section, American officers had a new thing the 16 millimeter camera, which consumers could purchase, and a lot of officers on the American side had purchased 16 millimeter cameras, and a lot of them in color. And they were filming the Russians, and when they'd film a Russian unit march by, they'd be anywhere from a third to half women. And that's why Patton said that he could, if Eisenhower would let him, he could be in Moscow in 2 weeks. He knew communism was going to be a problem. He knew that communist army, Russian army, was weakest at that time. In May, June of 1945, they were weaker than they had ever been before. They had suffered casualties beyond knowledge, but they still were punishing the Germans, weakening the German army. But Patton, the Germans that he had captured had surrendered at the end of the war, he was training them. They were actually drilling to go back to war. Patton wanted to take his army plus the Germans he'd captured and conquer Moscow, and he tried to get Eisenhower to let him do it. And Ike was led by the deep state Marxists and communists in Washington, D.C., and they wouldn't let him do it. Wouldn't let him destroy communism, and the biggest supporter of communism in the world at that time was Russia. We had a chance to get rid of that evil right then, and Patton saw it, wanted to do it, and they wouldn't let him. But anyway, the Germans, when that first winter hit, 1941, the Germans had long underwear, but it was single ply, 1 cloth thickness, and that was it. The Russian army had 2-ply. Their long underwear was 2-ply with padding. Their long underwear was like our comforters, 2-ply with padding. So they could stay a lot warmer. And the cold did not bother them that badly. And logistically, the German generals, Hitler, who was leading these generals, did not comprehend the resources that Russia had in Siberia, in the east. They had armies out there. They'd been fighting Japan for years and been kicking Japan's butt. So they had some real competent generals and soldiers and military in Siberia, way, way east in Siberia. And when they were able to load them on trains and haul them to Moscow, they got there by December of 1941, and boy, they hit the Germans hard. They drove the Germans back 200 kilometers, 130 miles, all the way from here to Chattanooga. Drove them back, and they had they had good tanks. And they could handle the cold. And the Germans hadn't learned a little trick that the Russians were familiar with, that if you mix a little gasoline with your oil, it won't freeze. The Russians knew that. So their mechanized artillery, rifles, weapons, assault rifles, artillery, tanks, everything wouldn't freeze up because they mixed a little gasoline in with their oil. Germans did not know this trick. Their oil froze solid, tight. It was like gum. The bolt actions in their rifles wouldn't work. Their machine guns wouldn't work. The mechanisms were froze up. Their engines, they built fires under their tanks trying to thaw the engines out to get them started. They did not know this little trick. Another thing the Germans failed to do, they failed to put stoves, heaters in their aircraft hangars So they couldn't work on their planes. Their plane engines would freeze up. The Russians had heating in their hangars. So they were able to work on their planes, and they were able to achieve our superiority over this great Luftwaffe, who didn't know that you had to have heaters in your hangars. It's amazing the shortcomings of the German army, that there were so many things that they overlooked and failed to comprehend that cost them, that made Barbarossa basically peter out there at the end. And it was amazing. And then uh, they lost the Battle of Stalingrad because of failure of logistics, failure of support units. Uh, Russian army was able to surround them, and they got something like 90,000 Germans to surrender, and the entire Sixth Army. And you know, even at the Battle of Stalingrad, with Germany's surrender and everything, the Russians still lost twice as many casualties as Germany, even counting the 90,000 that surrendered. Germany lost something like maybe 250,000 casualties and POWs. Stalingrad, Russia lost over 500,000 men there. They were just pouring men in there to try to keep Germany from conquering Stalingrad. They came really close, but failed in the end. And then you had that great Battle of Kursk, which Germans called Operation Citadel. They were supposed to surround a couple of million Russians and force them to surrender, surround them and conquer them. But right before Citadel started, Hitler pulled two of the top panzer divisions out, some Model, and them, the officers there at Kursk did not have a couple of top panzer divisions. It could have been the difference in that battle, because the Allies invaded Sicily and Italy, and Hitler had to move those two panzer divisions to Italy because the Italian army was just folding like a house of cards. They could not stand up against the British and Americans. And of course, Russia was receiving an awful lot of aid from the United States by the time of the Battle of Kursk, and they had received a whole lot of Shermans. You know, the Battle of El Alamein, where Montgomery defeated Rommel at a little town called El Alamein in Egypt. FDR had sent Montgomery 600 American Sherman tanks. So, along with his 200 tanks, he had 800 tanks against Rommel's 200. So, 800 against 200. At the end of the battle, Rommel had 50 tanks left, and Montgomery had about 100. So the Germans were knocking out his tanks a lot faster and everything, but when he had an extra 600 Sherman tanks, it just overwhelmed the Germans there at El Alamein. So Montgomery could give the United States credit for helping him win that battle. And you know, all the videos, films that were made of that war, Montgomery would not allow any of those Sherman tanks to be filmed. Only British tanks are to be filmed and sent back to the homeland for the British citizens to see that, oh, we didn't get any help from the United States. Look at the films. It's all our doing. Blah, 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 blah. But anyway, Stalin did the same thing. At the Battle of Kursk, a lot of the Germans wrote in their logbooks that, we're handling the T-34s, KV-1 Russian tanks, but these American Shermans are driving us batty. The Sherman was a real fast tank out in the open field. They were hard to hit. They could go about 40 miles an hour faster than any tank out there. And they would get around behind these German tanks and hit them in their weakest part in the rear. And so they were having a hard time with these Sherman tanks, according to their own logbooks and their own diaries and records and stuff. But Stalin would not allow any of the Shermans to be shown filmed. Only T-34s and KV-1 Russian tanks were allowed to be filmed during that battle. So, propaganda. We won this battle. The Americans didn't have nothing to do with it. I'll tell you what, when Ted Turner sent a crew in there in Russia in 1986 and interviewed a lot of these generals and things, it was on TV every night on Turner Broadcasting Station, every night for a week, Monday through Friday for about 2 hours. And they interviewed these people, and the Russian people knew what America had done for them, because they still remembered Studebaker. We sent thousands of Studebaker trucks over there. Jeep, they remembered the word Jeep for their officers to ride around in. They love those Jeeps, and we sent thousands of them over there. They remembered the Sherman tanks, so we sent thousands. And one of the great things that the Russian people really, really enjoyed was spam. They remembered spam. They talked about it when Ted Turner was over there 43 years afterwards, and they remembered spam. That was canned ham, came from the Chicago Meat Packing Company, and the Russians just could not believe how good spam was. They loved it. They'd open them cans up and eat it. They loved it. It was the greatest food they'd had. Their own military was not able to provide luxuries like spam. They remembered that. They remembered the help that Americans gave the people. That was the Russian people. The communist propagandists, they didn't want any filming of any of this American Shermans at the Battle of Kursk. But Shermans helped quite a bit, helped the Russians quite a bit at the Battle of Kursk. And Russians, their logistics, they'd moved a lot of their factories into the rural mountains where German bombers couldn't reach them, and they were producing a lot of tanks. That T-34, it was almost like Detroit. They were pouring them out, rolling them out off of them assembly lines. And, the Russian people, women helped them with everything. And, the Americans and British used women and support auxiliary groups and medical groups and stuff. The Americans and the British did not use women on the front lines, but they would fly airplanes from the factories to the frontline airports. They were nurses. They did a lot of medical work and stuff, but they were not allowed. They were not used as medics at the front lines. And women in Britain and America were used in factories. In Russia, they were used everywhere. And they were removed from a lot of small towns. They were just depopulated totally. The men off to war, the women off to war and off to the factories and stuff. But Britain and the U.S. would use women. Germany would not allow women to be used hardly for anything. in the medical course, some of the data services and typists and secretaries and stuff like that. Uh, Women under Nazism were to stay home, have babies, and raise them, and they were not allowed to be troops at the front line. Some of them became POWs because they were in medical units and stuff that were captured. But women were not allowed to do much under uh, National Socialism. They they were kept kept in the home, barefoot and pregnant. But anyway, the German invasion, Barbarossa, just simply petered out for lack of maintenance, lack of anticipation of how far the distances were, failure of maintenance services, failure of uh, keeping their oil working, keeping it in freezing wet temperatures. Uh, there was just a lot of failures on the part of the German army. And the German army was still so much more uh, uh, fa- uh, cruel. They murdered a lot of civilians, 13 to 20 million civilians. They butchered after they'd conquered towns. And the Russian military lost men in the military. There's they they were losing like 7 million men a year. So they lost like something like 30 to 35 million men casualties. Now think about that. The United States, we fought in Europe and in the Pacific. We had a major two-front war. We only lost 475,000 men in Europe and the Pacific. The Russians lost, my God, 75 times that. For every one man we lost, Russia lost 75. It was amazing the number of people. In fact, Stalin would not permit a census to be taken in Russia for years. He died in the early 1950s. He would not allow, because he did not want that secret to get out, that Russia was depopulated by World War II. They didn't have anything left. The Cold War was a sham on the part of our military because they were getting so much money. They lied to the American people about how strong Russia was. Russia wasn't able to invade the United States. They weren't able to fly bombers over the United States. They weren't able to fly missiles into the United States. They could, but their accuracy was unbelievably terrible. They'd fire a missile at New York, it'd probably hit Chicago or a wheat field in Kansas somewhere. I mean, it was Russia didn't have a thing, and but our military and our government kept the American people scared about this Red Scare because they were getting so much money that it was they didn't want it to stop, and so they defrauded the American taxpayer out of an awful lot of money to build these military forces we really didn't need at the time. But anyway, that is some of the reasons why Barbarossa failed, and it was an amazing attempt with too little and too little sport to make it happen the way it should have. Uh, Hitler was too successful in Poland, too successful in France and Belgium and Norway and Luxembourg. He thought he was unbeatable. but he couldn't fight the Russian army, Russian people, and nature, and distance, and volume. He couldn't handle it all when it all hit him at one time. But anyway, this is your hillbilly historian coming to you with a little bit of knowledge you will not get in your high school and college textbooks. You have a nice day. Thank you much.